British kings from Adam to Arthur. The British kings who ruled Britain prior to the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons had a profound influence on the spiritual development of Britain. The first Christians in the land were Britons, long before the arrival of Augustine. However, the story of the British or Welsh kings is not such a straightforward genealogy as with the English. See the page on Adam to Queen Elizabeth for that story. There are two main sources I'm using for tracing the British kings. Firstly, the History of the British by Nennius, a Welsh monk of the 9th century. Secondly, Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain. About 1200 Welsh monks were slaughtered at the Battle of Chester in the early 7th century by Ethelfrith of Northumbria at the instigation of Augustine, who was frustrated that the Welsh would not follow the Roman Catholic faith. The Saxons had converted to Roman Catholicism from a place of heathenism, but the Welsh already had the Christian faith received from the early church and did not want the Roman Catholic version. It is because of this that we find it hard to find records of Welsh history, as much of it was wiped out. However, enough survives for us to put a record together. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the history of the kings of Britain. Geoffrey was a cleric who lived in Monmouth, Wales in the 12th century. He translated the history of the British kings from the original Welsh into Latin. The history is fascinating reading, and there has been much discussion about its accuracy, but here I'm simply taking it at face value. Putting Nennius and Geoffrey together, we have a complete record from Adam through the first British king Brutus to the last king Cadwallader. The story actually starts with the fall of Troy to the Greeks. Aeneas escapes with his father Anchises and eventually arrives in Italy, but his father does not make it and dies in Sicily. It is from the line of Aeneas that both the Britons and the Romans trace their heritage. The following charts give the details. The first two charts are the record that Nennius gives us from Adam to a man called Trus. So we can see the first 10 generations as recorded in the book of Genesis up until Noah. Then Noah's son Japheth had a son called Javan. Nennius carries on the line from Javan down through these various people all the way until we get to this man called Thus. He had a son called Ugaman, then Fetabir, then Ilanus, then Hezeto, and eventually we get down to this man called Trus, the son of Dardanus, and that's as far as we're going with Nennius. But it's important to note that Nennius gave this genealogy as part of the record of British kings. In chapter 18, he gives Trus as the father of Anchises, who is the father of Aeneas the Trojan. The next 5 charts give the record from Aeneas onwards, as recorded by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Aeneas's great-grandson was Brutus, who made his way to Britain, landed at Totnes in Devon, and became the first British king. It's worth bearing in mind that the Britons were proud of their Trojan heritage, and Geoffrey records that when Julius Caesar came to Britain, he was aware that the Britons were of Trojan heritage, just as the Romans were. Other famous kings in the list are King Lear and King Cymbeline, both of Shakespearean fame. The most famous of all is King Arthur. Merlin is also mentioned by Geoffrey and appears during the reign of King Vortigern. Geoffrey provides synchronisms to put the kings in the context of other historical events. I have included these on the charts. From a Bible prophecy point of view, it is interesting how Geoffrey sees this history of the British kings in relation to other world and biblical events. It's not just about Britain, but about God's grand scheme of things. The two great heroes are Brutus and Arthur. The great villain is Vortigern, who betrayed his own country to the invading Saxons. There are also the brothers Belinus and Brennius, who achieved the sack of Rome. It was the coming of the Romans that diluted the Britishness of the royal line, as the British royalty intermarried with Roman nobles. In fact, King Geta had a Roman father and a Roman mother, which caused the Britons to refuse to accept him. Despite various successes, there was too much infighting and civil war for the British kings to survive the constant attacks from their various enemies: the Picts, the Scots, the Irish, the Huns, and finally the Saxons. So looking through Geoffrey's list, we have Truce, who was mentioned by Nennius. His son was Dardanus. According to Geoffrey, Dardanus was the father of Anchises. Then we come to Aeneas, the son of Anchises. Aeneas was famous from the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, which obviously the Greeks won. Aeneas managed to escape with his father Anchises and went to Italy and became the king of Italy. He had a son called Ascanius, who had a son called Silvius, and Silvius' son was Brutus. Brutus accidentally killed his father Silvius in a hunting accident and got expelled from Italy and made his way back to Greece, where he discovered his ancestors, the Trojan people, still in captivity to the Greeks. So he leads the subject Trojans out of Greece, and after several adventures leads them eventually to Britain. They land at Totnes in Devon, and Brutus becomes the first king of the Britons, and basically all the British kings would trace their heritage back to Brutus. It's interesting to see that Geoffrey puts in these synchronisms to try and tie in the British kings with biblical events. So he says Brutus's reign was about the same time as Eli's leadership of Israel. Then we have Brutus' son Lucrinus and his wife. They ruled about the same time as Samuel's judgeship of Israel. Then there's a long list of kings that are tied in with biblical events happening at the same time as their reigns. It's interesting that at number 49 here we come to Lear, who's the same as Shakespeare's King Lear, who famously had the three daughters. I think it was Goneril, Regan and Cordelia, that Geoffrey mentions and mentioned in Shakespeare's play. Obviously Cordelia was the most faithful of the daughters, and she eventually became Queen of Britain. Then there's just lots more kings mentioned, and Britain gradually descends into conflict and civil war. It's not really possible to follow a genealogical line of kings. The king tended to be the mightiest warrior rather than a hereditary king. So it just goes on, an increasingly random list of kings. It's worth mentioning two brothers, Belinus and Brennius, who, according to Geoffrey, actually managed to sack Rome in apparently around about 390 BC. Then we carry on. The Romans invade Britain 55 to 54 BC. And then we come to Cymbeline, who's the same king as Shakespeare's Cymbeline. And then we have the birth of Christ. Following on from there, we have more kings. We're now in the time of the Romans, and this is the period when the British kings intermarry with the Roman nobility. Interesting to note here, we've got King Coel, who many people is the same king as is mentioned in the nursery rhyme, Old King Cole was a merry old soul. Carry on down, and eventually we come to the infamous Vortigern, who felt the country was besieged by the Picts and the Scots, the Irish, and invited the Saxons over to help him fight them, which basically started off the Saxon invasion of Britain, with Hengist and Horsa coming to Britain around about 450 AD. Then eventually we come to the most famous king of all, Arthur, the son of Uther Pendragon. And Arthur briefly revives the fortunes of the British and wins many famous victories. Eventually wounded in something called the Battle of Camblan, and handed the throne on to Constantine III. And we just carry on down the line now to the last king of all, Cadwallader. During his reign, the Britain really collapsed with famine and plague, and he ended up leaving and going to Brittany. So that's the line of British kings. And so far it's just been mainly looking at details and information. In the next part we will look at the prophetic and spiritual consequences of the reign of the British kings. Thank you for listening. If you found this interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com.